everybody's a frog being boiled alive, right? Like they're just everybody else is living in this space. And I'm coming to it from outside where all of it's unfamiliar.
And you're like, you guys know this water is really fucking hot, right?
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 370 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, I'm the web programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's June 30th, 2020. And before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. And we'd also like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net who donate money monthly to the podcast to help keep this thing running. So thank you very much. I just want to say we got through the intro just straight through, and I don't even know what to do with myself now.
Yeah. You're so on the rails that it's uncomfortable. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's always a challenge where I'm thinking like, how far can I get? How far can I get before something happens? And, you know, I think different strategies. Maybe if I just keep going, you know, without pausing, then I can make it. But I've never actually succeeded. And now I'm like a dog that caught the car that was chasing. Like, I don't know what am I supposed to do? Normally we're in the middle of 6 different topics by this point.
It's true.
And I don't know where do we go from here, guys?
I think you just stay on the rail, you know, like that dog finally catching the car. You just stand next to the car. You know what I mean? Yeah, you just
keep running.
Be near it.
Keep running alongside it.
Keep
going,
I'm
here now. I'm here now.
We're here now.
Well, let's talk about the Iron Chef.
Yeah.
How about that? Let's jump
good.
into that.
That's random. We did it. Got us back off the rails.
Enough. Yeah, I started watching Iron Chef with my wife about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and just finished it last night. It's on Netflix. And for those unfamiliar with the format of the show, it is a cooking show. It's sort of actually, I think it's kind of the original concept for these kind of competitive
definitely
shows.
One of the originals, at least.
Yeah. And it's very, very intense. There's this wonderful sort of flair to it where there's a chairman who's this guy who just sort of screams random words in his sentences, which is somehow amazing and hilarious, not weird at all. And then they have like a special ingredient, and it's basically these challenger chefs come in and they have to fight against the chairman's collected Iron Chefs. And if you beat the chef that you are paired against, then you get to go to the final round, where then you would compete against all 5 of the Iron Chefs. So just whoever the best challenger is competes against all 5, which is what we watched last night, which is an insane proposition in order to basically win. So it's very, very fun. I'd highly recommend it. And one of the things that's been really interesting about it is I suddenly realized after watching this, so they do like sort of a telecasting thing with it, where it's almost like sports casting, right? Where there's these 2 chef hosts who are essentially narrating what's happening on, you know, in either camp as these people are cooking. So you actually have a better understanding, I feel like, than you do in most situations, where most situations they're just focusing on like whatever the problem is. Like someone's always sort of freaking out. There's like, you know, clutter going on. But these people are so good that there's no problems. You know what I mean? Like they're just doing stuff. And so these telecasters are basically just telling you what's actually happening on the cooking side.
And they're also experts, right? So they're trying to guess also. Like they're like, oh, ooh, it looks like they're doing this.
Yes.
They'll like describe what they think is about to happen, and then they'll comment to each other about like the history of this approach and other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
so it's actually
it's kind of cool.
There's a really rich context then for whatever's happening. That actually is, I think, inspiring enough that it really does make you want to cook. I don't usually like to actually try cooking stuff, more on the baking side, but the show has been interesting enough that yesterday, after watching the whole thing, I was like, I'm going to make a sauce for some marinate some chicken and some sauce, and I'm going to do what they do, which is I didn't realize so much of what, you know, cooking is really, when you get down to it, is just like blending something first. It's just blending a sauce essentially, and then, you know, putting stuff in that and then doing stuff with that. Right. That's basically
the secret to good cooking is actually all about the sauces. That's just always
correct.
what it actually
It's
is.
just it's a blender.
Yeah, it's a
having
blender. It's so that was bizarre. After watching all the shows, I realized just how much of the show is just clips of people just like jamming stuff into a blender. You know what I mean? And so I was like, I have a blender. I could do that. I can, that's my close approximation of being an Iron Chef is just busting the blender out and throwing some oranges and stuff in there. That's what I did last night. Made my own weird kind of jerk-ish orange sauce thing. And I'm going to cook that
Jerkish orange sauce.
Yeah. And I don't know. It's very fun. I'd highly recommend it for people. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, it does kind of take some of the magic out of it because, like, I love Indian food, and they've got all these amazing curries and sauces and stuff. And a while back, we, my wife and I, Sampy and I, were cooking some stuff, and it's like, all right, we got to make the sauce for this thing. It's like, how do you make the sauce? Just throw like 3 tomatoes into a blender.
Yep.
Like, what the fuck? That's it? It's just a whole ass tomato. You just throw it into a blender. It's like, yeah, it just makes a really good base, Yeah. Nothing to it. It's just a tomato. That's what the sauce is.
Yeah, that's what I realized. I was like, oh, it's mainly just throwing, and especially if you're doing it at any kind of scale. Like as soon as you're actually feeding, basically like 4 people or so, then yeah, you start operating in like whole things. You're no longer having to chop, so you just throw a whole tomato in.
Yeah, just throw the whole thing in.
It's fine.
But we also, you tend to think of these things more holistically, like a tomato is a solid object, right? And so like having that tomato be a liquid feels weird. But then you realize like it actually is, mostly gooey, juicy stuff on the inside.
All of
and
it
so
is,
when you,
right?
So when you start to blend it, then like the juices kind of like take over and it serves as like the foundation to mix up the rest of the whatever solid is left, right? So yeah, it's one of those things that is pretty obvious in retrospect,
Yeah.
but
I don't know. Yeah, it didn't quite hit me until I just saw these, basically Olympic level athletes just using blenders constantly, and I was like, "Is that the secret? Blending?"
Well,
blender.
And the thing that really kind of gets your goose on this is if you think like, what kind of food would you make like 100 years ago if you didn't have a blender? You didn't have whatever. Probably your options are way, way, way more limited, right? Or if you wanted to make a sauce, man, is that like a whole afternoon of just like
you got chop and mash? He's basically
that's the
mashing
main
and
thing,
chopping.
Like all these recipes are like the core of all these things, right? From all these different cultures that well predate electricity, So yeah, people just did that. They just did the work. It just took forever.
Yeah, essentially, how did you blend something during the Aztec days? You know what I mean? It's what's the blending equivalent, and how do you infuse that into something?
Yeah, your blending is paid for in blood. You you needed an army of servants to do your blending, and that's how you had a smoothie or whatever back in those days. So, but technology sets us all free, right?
Yeah.
It's all about your tools. Speaking of tools, Adam did a big workflow analysis this week in the studio, and something kind of interesting came out of it. So let's talk about like what is this workflow analysis? Why are we doing it? And what came of it?
Yeah, so I'll say this is prompted by another thing, which is I had sat down to work on something in GameMaker. I don't usually work in GameMaker. I'm usually doing stuff in the web domain. And I immediately ran into a bug, like instantly. And I was like, oh, fuck, I need to go report this. And I went to go figure out how to report bugs to GameMaker. And then so Seth and Sher were telling me how to go through the process. And they were like, so first you got to go to the website and it's going to always have logged you out. So you got to log back in. And then you can't find it like with a Google search. So you just have to know what the URL is, or bookmark it or something because it's not searchable. So you have to like just know how to get there. And then once you get there, you go like click this and then click that, and it's going to give you a form. You need to choose the right option to then say I'm making a bug report, and it's going to give you another form that's going to be like, okay, fill out all these things, including go find this log file, go find this, make a project, get it zipped up so we can upload it, et cetera, et cetera. So it was just this long, horrible process, and I was looking at this and I was like, no, I'm not going to do this.
Like by the time you get to that form, then the stuff on the form is your checklist. Right? It's like, here's all the things that you need, except you're on a temporary web form on a login session, right? And so that means that like if you take the hour and a half or whatever to prepare all the materials to upload and then try to send it, you may have been logged
timed
out
out
in the
probably.
meantime,
Yeah.
and then you can't send it, and also all your stuff is lost, and then you got to retype everything.
Yeah, and that's also but you're like moving around your operating system, like trying to find all the files and stuff. It was just horrible. So I didn't even do it once. I was just like, okay, I'm gonna make a tool that
You just
helps.
looked at it and you were like, no.
Yeah. So I was like, I need to make a tool that will at least make this easier. Because for me, I was like also having less familiarity with using GameMaker. So like Seth and Sure have been doing this for a long time. And so even though it's a pain in the ass, they know like, oh, here's where I go find this and, and all of that.
There's enough fluency to overcome just how
The tedium.
the tedium of it.
Yeah.
Well, not to overcome the tedium, but just to like really,
Deal with it.
yeah.
Yeah, you could work through it. And so, but it was even stuff just like getting the right stuff to open in GameMaker and all that. So I was like, okay, what is kind of the minimum thing I need to do to make it so that I can just make this easy so that I can basically run a command and then cause a new project to appear that I can use to like make my test case to demonstrate the issue, right? Because that was the other thing you had to do is you had to like open up GameMaker, like make a new project and then like name it and then go in and open that one up.
All
and
these
all of
things,
that.
yeah.
Figure out where to save it, all this stuff. So I basically just made a little manager that can make new issue projects for you and that can automatically run those projects and collect all their logs, and then can collect information from your system to take all of the things that you shouldn't have to know, like what version of the operating system am I on? What version of GameMaker am I using? Like just take all that stuff that we can just detect it, have you write out the stuff that a human has to do, and then like have that in one place. So that then the final step is you can just run another command and it opens up an email for you that has it already pre-populated and ready to go. So you can just, and it opens up the folder that has all the files in it because I moved them all into the same place. And you just plop the files in, send off the email, right? So I made this thing.
And we called this tool Yeet.
The Yo-Yo Yeeter, because GameMaker is no longer Yo-Yo Games. They've changed their name to GameMaker, but for us, they will always be Yo-Yo. So it's the Yo-Yo Yeeter where we make it their problem.
So we can yeet bugs faster over to the Yo-Yo Games team, or now the GameMaker team.
Yep. So this was a command line tool, which basically means, just for anybody who's unfamiliar, just like in movies when they open up like when a hacker's doing something and they open up a little window and it's just text and it's like glowing, it's a hacker terminal. So command line tools are things you just type into. You just type some command you have to know and then hit enter, basically, right? And so all the tooling that I've developed for this kind of stuff is all command line stuff, which means if you're like me and interface with it constantly, then you just like remember the commands and it's not a big deal, right? But if you don't interface with this constantly, then there's a whole bunch of stuff that you have to be keeping track of that isn't just fluent and obvious. Like, what folder am I in? Because there are ideas like this that are just not immediately understandable. And so what we found over time is that as all these tools that I've made have been made and deployed, we've actually used them less and less unless they've been pulled into other systems that are already automated in some way because they're just hard to access, hard to figure out.
Some of these tools may be something that are intended to solve a problem that we run into once every couple of months or something, right?
Yep.
And like in the intervening time, something may have changed in how the GameMaker IDE works. And so the tool may be out of date and need updated. But then also the exact thing that we needed to do, it may be possible, but if you don't remember all of the command line commands or how to do it, then that becomes awkward. And so then it actually becomes a problem for Adam because, when that 2-month window happens or whatever, and we boot up that tool, the first thing that somebody does is goes and gets Adam and is like, how do I do this thing again? or is
just
this
doesn't
thing
even
working as
know-
intended? Or
or people don't even know that it can do something that they want it to do.
That's
right?
usually the one, actually. It's like,
Right.
Yeah, which I
you
think
can
is
go read your read documentation for a thing you know exists, but if
Yeah.
you don't know it exists, then you're just
Then you
sort
can't
of-
go looking for it.
yeah.
Yep. So I'd wrap this thing up and I was demoing the final version and I was like, is this good? Is this doing what we like? Is this a good milestone 0 kind of a thing that helps solve the problem, gets us into a decent spot? And if we wanted to build from here, we could, but we don't necessarily need to. And the answer was basically yes, but this is now one too many things that we can do from the command line, right? Because it was already too
It's
many
yet
things.
another command line tool.
It's
for
yet
us
another one.
to remember.
Yeah, even though I built it into the same system, right? So that like at base, there's only one thing you really have to remember. But then from there, you have to do this exploratory process, right? And you still have to remember, even beyond that these things are possible and what you might have to do to get ready for it, right? And so So Seth was just like, can we have this in a UI or something, like some kind of a desktop, GUI based application that I can interact with so that I can just see what I can do without having to know, what I can do.
Yeah. Well, and even better is stuff like, one of the things that is a big sticking point for me about command line things isn't necessarily just the remembering of them, but it's that they don't remember anything.
Right.
So
Right.
it's like if I open up Game Maker, right? Game Maker's like, hey, here's all the projects that you opened in the past, right? And I can just click on Crashlands 2 and it opens, right? Because it has a cache. It has a memory of what I've done before. But command line tools are oftentimes built just in this way where they kind of
You provide all of the information.
you
in
provide
the
all the
command.
information just in commands, yeah.
And they can
like
cache
if I-
stuff, right? But even when they do, how do you show that to a user when all you can show them is
It's
like
a single line.
It's a single line of text,
basically.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so what would often happen is like if I want to run a command to import sprites into our GameMaker project, then I need to give. So we use our tool called Stitch for this, right? So like I need to provide the directory where the sprites are that I want to import, as well as information about the GameMaker project and whether to like force override it, even if I have changed, all this stuff. And so I end up like making a .cmd file that has this command pre-made, and I have that laying around. So basically, like I have a thing I can double click to do it that I pre-composed this little
your typical use
desktop
case,
shortcut,
basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then you kind of have like everybody in the studio developing their own little workarounds so that they can use these command line tools in an effective way.
Yeah, and it gets
but
more complicated too, because in order for these tools to be useful, they have to cover a wide array of cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they need lots of options. And then the more options they have, the harder it is for you to know exactly, because now it makes it so that something you want to do is possible, but knowing how to do it and that it's possible. Because that same tool, like on importing a sprite, because we had this problem where it's like the sprites can be exported to have a certain folder hierarchy so that they're easy to understand how they're organized in like the raw images, straight from the art pipeline. But on the game maker side, they have to come in and be named a certain way so that the names don't clash and other kind of stuff, right? So I built into the tool a way to tell it how to rename things as they come in, right? But if you don't, so there's that, and there's other kinds of properties like this.
so it's basically a setting, right?
It's a
But
setting,
like,
Yeah, a bunch of different settings. Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't have a settings page to know that it's doing.
You just
that
have a
when you
line of
import.
text that just is a collection of settings. The name of the setting and the value, the name of the setting and the value, just like over and over again.
So how did this arrive at a workflow analysis?
So then Seth was like, can we make this easier, right? And I had just booted up GameMaker to try to use it. And the first thing I had to do at that time, because I got that window pop up that was like, oh, hey, there's a new version of GameMaker. Do you want to install it? And I was like, I don't know. Do I?
Do I?
Yeah, right.
So
Work
then
on
I
a team.
pinged,
It's
yeah.
up
So then
to
I pinged
me.
Seth and Sure, and I was like, hey, what version are we on of GameMaker right now? And Sure's like, well, I'm currently testing stuff to see if we can use the latest one. So I'm using this one, whatever, right? And then Seth's like, oh, I'm using this one because this was the last stable one. And but every once in a while he's trying one, right? And then Sam is using whichever one Seth told him to use last, right? Probably. And
Correct.
but there's no way just to know this, right? So I'd run into that problem as well. And for the most part, I get to ignore it because I'm working on the tools.
Because the answer
side.
is it depends.
The answer is it depends. Yeah, and it has to, right? Because that's actually how these systems work. Is that the way that the Game Maker engine or any engine works is dictated by what its version, what its collection of behaviors is in that moment, right? And if you build a game on top of that, then it's assuming that all that stuff behaves in that way. So if you change the version out from underneath it, you've changed what the game engine does. And sometimes that's not a problem. Oftentimes that is a problem. And then you got to go try to fix it, right? So we need to be able to know what version are we supposed to be on. So in our automatic pipeline for making builds, we have a solution for this. It's kind of hacky and manual, but we have a solution there. So that as long as somebody remembers to tell the system what the version it's supposed to be is, it'll always make that version and it's fine. But if you forget, then it'll make whatever it thought it was supposed to, right? So these things, like, it all requires like remembering stuff. And then when I ask what the version's supposed to be, it's not the latest one. It's not the one I have. So it's some other version. So I'm like, oh, how do I
Now you got to go get
find
it
that
somewhere.
right? So that I'm trying to like find that new version. That I finally find it, and then I go through the install process and so much like manual clicking stuff, right? And then I just had to kind of wait for a couple of minutes while it installs. And so then that happened. I was like, okay, so submitting bug reports is terrible, and I didn't know that until I tried to do it because again, I don't interface with this stuff. And my main exposure to GameMaker is when I'm making tools for it, so that I don't even care what version I'm on. But now all of a sudden I was going to make something in GameMaker for game context stuff. So I knew the version mattered. And then now I suddenly was interfacing with this horrible process of like, how do I figure out what to do and how do I
know what version I need and how do I change between different versions?
So basically between these two things that I had just immediately experienced, and then Seth being like, this command line stuff is getting too hard to use. We need a better system. Then I was like, okay, clearly these aren't the only things because like I just interfaced with this thing in 2 points and both of them were horrible experiences. So I was like, okay, I need to see what the whole thing looks like because everybody's a frog being boiled alive, right? Like they're just, everybody else is living in this space. And I'm coming to it from outside where all of it's unfamiliar.
And you're like, you guys know this water is really fucking hot.
It's really hot. Yeah, you're like, yeah. And of course, like
what?
Yeah, they know it, but in a way where it's like they've just had to put up with it, right? So it becomes kind of background knowledge and like background frustration. And it's changing behavior. It prevents people from downloading new updates, from trying new versions that come out because it's just so tedious. And it also results in conflicts because somebody will think they're on the right version. Stuff starts to not work. And they're like, oh, there must be a bug in the latest commit or something, the latest version of the game that came out. When it's actually, no, they're just on the wrong version of the system, right? So I was like, okay, let's take a step back here and just talk about the game development pipeline and how everybody interfaces with it. And just like, I'm going to go sit down with Sam, Seth, and Shure individually and just say, starting from a closed machine, right? So like none of your applications are open and so on. I want to know what the whole ass pipeline looks like. Like you meet your computer with your human body and you say, I want to work on Crashlands 2, right? What happens?
What happens next?
What is the sequence of steps that happen? And then I had a bunch of follow-up questions from other stuff that I knew were issues to get more detail on those. So I basically had like these kind of high-level prompts where I was like, I want you to walk me through it. I don't want you to rely on remembering. I want you to walk me through the process so I can ask you questions and so that we can try to reveal some stuff that you didn't realize was as big of a pain in the ass as it is. And then also have some focus questions on the stuff that I already knew were problems. And so I did this with the three of them, and there's two interesting things happened. One was, as we were talking through, as they were like walking me through their process, nobody mentioned the versioning problem, right? As in like, that wasn't part of the workflow in anybody's brains. As in like, when I boot up and I start getting ready to work, I think it was on Shure's machine. On somebody's machine, the pop-up came up and he just immediately closed it because he was like, no, I don't need a new version, right? But that wasn't thought of as part of the workflow, right? Of like deciding what version to use. But then as soon as I brought it up and I was like, okay, well, how do you decide which one to be on and how do you get that, right? Then everyone was like, oh, it's this horrible process. And they like described the whole thing, right? And so then at the end of all of this, when I got everybody's stuff and then all the specific stuff, the general stuff, and I was like, what would you prioritize here when it comes to these workflow issues, right? All three of them were like, oh, this GameMaker versioning thing is just a fucking nightmare, right? To work around. And so I found this really interesting for two reasons. One is everybody agreed, despite like the way that Sam uses GameMaker is very different from how Shure and Seth do. Shure and Seth don't use it the same way because they're all trying to solve different problems. But for all cases, this thing is so janky and so frustrating. And everybody who even touches GameMaker has to work with it and deal with it. That everyone was like, yes, we need this fixed, right? So that was very interesting. That there's this like really intense, horrible aspect of the pipeline that everybody was aware of and everybody was dealing with, but everybody treated as like a fact, right? They were like, yeah, this is just horrible. And so much so as a fact that it wasn't a part of people's like conscious workflow as they would describe it, right? They might often
an interruption that would happen.
Yeah, it's an interruption to the workflow.
Yeah. So my recollection is like when we were talking through it, the way I talked about the version stuff as like, that's sometimes what happens as like the first part of my day is basically having to decide whether to sort of check out the newest version and then spend the morning evaluating it and then figuring out what to do and like getting that installed and stuff. But yeah, you're right. Like my framing of it wasn't like, oh, this is part of my workflow, right?
Yeah.
It was more like, this is a thing that gets in the way of me doing my job.
Mhm.
And sometimes, and there's like a kicking the can thing that happens, which is ideally I can just stay on the version that I'm on, and the version that I'm on does the things that I need it to do, and it's stable, right? It's not crashing or broken or whatever. But that's impossible because everything always changes all the time, right? Like there's new Windows updates and there's new iOS updates, and like we use Spine, and Spine has updates, and there's all these things changing around GameMaker. And so GameMaker has to stay up to date to continue to be compatible with all these technologies, right? So sometimes those technologies change, and we are forced to move up in versions. And when we enter into that state, sometimes we'll pull down a new GameMaker version, and it fixes that problem, but there's 15 other new problems. So we can't upgrade. And then we enter into this mode where we are just like every few days checking out the newest version and evaluating and and we just keep doing that until we find the one that now once again works, right?
And then try to not change again for as long as possible.
Yeah, and that could be months, right? So like sometimes it's a almost daily part of the workflow. And then other times there's like 3 or 4 months that go by where we just don't think about it at all, right?
When it works,
because
it's
of that,
invisible, basically.
Yeah.
And when it doesn't
Well,
work,
that's exactly,
it randomly blows up your mornings.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was treated just as a separate problem. There's game dev, and then there's trying to get a stable version of GameMaker, right? And those are two things. But the thing where like we will lock the version to the game and ensure that everybody knows what that is, and have a way to like test stuff easily and all that, like the aspects of it that make it part of the workflow, like part of just what you're doing and part of what we're trying to guarantee and avoid problems with and so on, it wasn't seen as one cohesive thing, right? It was just two separate problems. And so I find this really interesting because it's just a framing thing, right? It's really easy, because I mean, I do this with my own work too, right? It's really easy to do things like think of turning on your computer and then getting your stuff booted up, all your windows and stuff, right? That's one thing you have to do. It's not part of your work. That's just getting ready to work, right? But it's actually part of your workflow, right? Because it's part of the process. How do you do that? How do you do all of the components? And so it ended up being a really interesting result. And the fact that everybody agreed to me was that like that big thing of like, oh shit, this is perfect. This is a high leverage thing to go hit. But that it's that kind of a bummer where it's like, I know there are other things like that out there that we're not aware of yet, right? Where there's going to be like each one of us on our own stuff, any pair of us, right? There's going to be some other piece that's like this that has a similar level of frustration that we're dealing with because we're not seeing it as part of the workflow, right? We're not seeing it as part of the stuff to deal with, or we do, but have kind of accepted it in its current state so that it's a thing that's kind of in the way that you just deal with when it comes up, but it's not something that we think about actually addressing. And I mean, I know I catch myself in these constantly where there'll be something that I've been doing and all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second, this sucks. Why am I doing it this way, right? But it may have been months or years even of doing it that way before all of a sudden someday I'm like, wait a second, I don't have to accept this, you know?
What I do like about this, though, is that there's a weird sort of a contagious nature to that process refinement in the sense that, so Adam and I had this conversation, and then I had to do two, like one big kind of design thing the next day, and then an art related thing. And in both cases, within like 15 minutes of working on both of those, realized that there was a way faster way to do what I was going to do, and but versus the way that I had been doing it for a long time. In the art case, it was like I regularly copy paste or regularly take screenshots and put them into Clip Studio and do some drawing, whatever, over top. And they always come in at double resolution because of the size of my monitor, compared to what the actual game screen is. And I need them that size. And so I've always been manually having them, and getting them to size. Halving them. And then, to get to the right scale. And I was like, duh. Let me just quit doing this because it's a little fiddly, typing in your numbers and doing all that shit. So she made like a quick macro for it, Clip Studio Paint, but made a little button for it. And I just click a button and it's done. So that's what I really like about this stuff is that when you as a team, even if you have one person on your team who very aggressively is doing this just for a thing, not even like as their job, which is sort of like what Adam does almost like as a thing. But even if you have a person who just gets on a bend for a while and they're like, I just hate this particular aspect of what I do, and I'm going to make it really good. It naturally has a lot of weird I think, contrasts those peaks and valleys in your own experience that are even completely different things. So it makes you kind of a little more aware, I think, of
I think it's a reminder that the things that you're frustrated with are things that you can potentially change, right? Because I think because we get used to whatever the workflow is, and we're still frustrated about various things, and we know we are. We're not unaware of like the parts that suck, right? We've just sort of encapsulated them,
discount them in a way.
Yeah, we discount them, and it's just part of doing business. It's just like that's just a thing that has to happen to get to the other side, and we all do this constantly. And it's this having a reminder every once in a while, because I find this for my own stuff too. So I'll go tackle one thing where I'll be like, oh, I need to address this. This is just too shitty, And in the process of doing it, I'll be using my normal tools, my normal workflows, and my normal approaches, right? And while I'm trying to make something else not suck, I'm suddenly more aware of how I'm feeling about the other stuff, so that it's not just frustration as part of the process. It's frustration. I'm like, hey, wait a second, why is that frustrating? Like what is that? Can I do something about this? Yeah, so I think there is something about the reminder, because again, we all know it. We're all feeling it's mostly an emotional response to stuff, which is just there's some frustrating shit that you just go do. You find yourself just doing it and being frustrated the whole time, right? It's just a shitty experience. You just do it. And over time, because like the first time that happens, that was you solving a problem. You were like, oh, how do I make this work? And it was a shitty thing you had. It was like a shitty experience, but it was you focusing on solving a problem, right? So at that point, it was the problem that was really the problem, And so since you solved it, you're in a better spot. And it becomes harder to see that even though it's a better spot because you've solved a problem, the solution that you have still is unpleasant.
Problematic.
Right. It still is unpleasant. Yeah. And so it just gets so easy to not see these things. But I think that reminder that you can step back and reevaluate and not have to accept stuff, right? Yeah. I think it lowers the threshold of where you're like, no, because like my threshold is at the fucking floor at this point, right? Where if something is just a little bit annoying, I'm just like, no, I'm not going to put up with this, right? But it's really hard to see. And for me too, it's really hard to see when it's something you're already doing.
Yeah. New things.
Your threshold goes higher.
Well, it's because if it's something that you're already doing, then you have a time scale in mind where you say like, okay, doing this thing, putting up with this thing, take me 10 minutes, take me 20 minutes. I know that because I've done it 100 times, right?
Yep.
So that's a known. And if it's something that's sporadic, like this, game maker versioning thing, it's like it could hit you again this afternoon or 3 weeks from now or a month from now, right? And so all you know for certain is that you can just dump like 10 or 20 minutes into just dealing with it now, and then move on, right? But you already have a plan, like you're doing that annoying thing so that you can go do the real thing.
It's just in the way. You just need to get it.
It's in the way. Yeah. You want to get it over with, move on to the work, the real work, right? And it's so hard to say, you know what? Fuck my plan. I'm not going to do any of the stuff that I was planning on doing. I ran into this problem, and I'm going to, and also instead of just getting through the problem the way I normally do, I'm going to change course entirely.
It's basically
come up with an entirely new solution for this.
Yeah, it's basically saying things are not in the way; things are the way, right? Yeah. It's basically saying if you run into something, then you need to get in there, you get into it instead, and say, "This is now what I'm gonna deal with because fuck this bug system, this booting up and trying to figure out what is even happening on the Game Maker versions thing." Etc. It's like the problem of trying to solve the intended problem is basically the thing to focus on at the end of the day.
Yeah, and sporadic stuff is the worst culprit for this, because if you're doing it constantly, well, I guess if you're doing it constantly, there's two ways that can go. One is it just keeps on happening. You're like, fuck, finally, I'm going to fix this. At some point, it's too much, right? But it can also just become a background thing because you're doing it constantly, right? But still, it often leads to like, no, you just finally get tired of it, right? Mm-hmm. But sporadic stuff is like a fucking tricky one because you go, it's like it comes up again and you're like, oh, well, Yeah, I could fix
Just
it,
deal
but this
with it.
only happens every few weeks, you know? And you just, like, it's in the way. And as soon as it's not in the way, you have like weeks of a stretch to not have to do anything, right? So you really just want to get through it, because imagining having to do it again is basically impossible, because it's, you know, your future self has to deal with that. And so those ones are, and every time else you interface with those, you also have the least context. And so you end up problem solving already, just trying to figure out how to use the thing that sucks. Like, how do I do the thing that sucks that I rarely do, right? Because part of why it sucks is it's hard to do, and then you rarely do it, and so you have to rebuild all this context. And so, like, the problem-solving domain you're in is, oh yeah, how do I do this, right? It's not, how do I make this not suck? It's just, how do I do this again? You know, how does this work? Yeah. So that's particularly nefarious of a thing to pay attention to.
Yeah. I think the last bit of this that I found very interesting is that this is the first time that across, like, basically, you know, multiple departments in the studio, there's been
We have departments.
if there's been that unanimous agreement, which I think is largely about how the tool usage has evolved over time, and with the game changer in particular, what that's done, which is that it's fully integrated me into the, weirdly enough, we used it to get me so that I could modify Game Maker without like modifying Game Maker, but it actually gets me in it such that I'm actually doing way more modification of Game Maker itself and using Git and stuff than I ever have in the past, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, without the game changer, your only move would have been to like import sprites into the Game Maker project and then just push them.
Yeah.
But you couldn't actually put them into the game.
Couldn't see the context.
So you importing them was a pointless thing to do, because all that would do is then they would just sit there forever until I could get around to hooking them up, right? And so now that you don't have to use a Game Maker to actually implement the sprites, you are now using Game Maker way more to import them, because you can implement them. So by cutting down the requirement to use it, this is like the Jevons paradox, like just perfectly, right? It's like, now that you don't have to use Game Maker to do stuff, you're using Game Maker way more to do stuff.
It's a silly thing.
Because it's because of the stuff that you're doing is different, and that now becomes doable. But there's another. So this is a bit of an aside, but it's related to like this game changer and surprises, you know, stuff. Where as we were going through these workflow things, I was also asking about like the versioning process and the release process, how like getting the game out to QA and then to players eventually, right? Like, what does the process of kicking that off look like? And one of the things that Seth had mentioned when we were talking about it was that since we've moved our build pipeline into a cloud-based system instead of doing it locally, it's all slower, because like the machines that you're renting to do this stuff are pieces of shit, you know. So it's all slower. It has to go over a network. It's harder to cache things, and we have to like download lots of big files and stuff. So it's just significantly slower. But this actually hasn't, like, it felt like a problem just because it was slow.
Sort of like a fact.
And at first as Seth was describing it, he was like, yeah, now I find myself making fewer releases, because like if I start a release now, then like 30 minutes later, if I'm like, ooh, I'd fix something or added like finish this feature or something, and then go to release that one, the other one's is still building when this one goes to go out, right? And so then that seems dumb. But then he thought about it a little bit more, and he was like, although actually I don't even need to, because back in like the Levelhead days, every feature was synonymous with Seth changing the code in some way, right? Every little tiny thing, no matter what it was. And so
every anything that changed needed a completely new build to go through the build pipeline.
Just every. So he could easily spit out 5 builds in a day, 10 builds in a day, each one with a slight improvement to the game, right? And sure, we only needed the last one, really, the one that gets tested, right? But the idea is we don't want you to have to like decide, like, oh, is this the time I finally make a build or whatever? But now that most of these changes are happening remotely via the game changer, independently of like the actual code in the game, then the vast majority of changes now, the little ones, the ones that are just like a huge accumulation of small tweaks to things, right, are happening external to the code, which meant just we don't have to deploy as much. There aren't because now Seth is spending all of his time instead making large things that take a long time.
Yeah.
as in like half a day to days, right?
Deployments are actually
So-
new features instead of new content or tweaks to existing features,
Yeah.
which is
Well, they're new. Yeah, they're new entire like core mechanics that use the stuff that comes from the game changer. But yeah, so we have these like live deployments where like our QA team can be actively playing the game and testing it, and then they can receive an update to stuff via the automatic updating process of the game changer without them ever closing the game or anything, right? And so it feels weird for me because I'm so used to this feeling that like I really got like, especially during Levelhead, I really got onto that, small batch, just like fix things quickly, update things quickly, get those builds out. But the nature of my work has now changed a lot to like, making these big updates to larger game systems and deploying things far less frequently. And it feels like, on my end, the game is just sitting there unchanged in the meantime, when really it's actually getting tons of changes really fast, multiple times per day, deployed to the QA team. It's just that that's happening through a different pipe.
Externally. Yeah.
But it's a different pipe completely.
And this was a thing we didn't even think about when we were, even though it's a guaranteed outcome of what we were doing with the game changer. But we didn't actually register it explicitly like that was going to happen. And one of the things that it did is it took what is easily the most troublesome and expensive and difficult part of the game development process, which is creating the builds and getting them out to people, right? It's the most fragile, like technically challenging part. And it's just slow as shit because like you got to go through, because you have to go through review from each of the stores. You got to get through QA. You got to like get the build, make sure it even works. You got to have all these different SDKs, all these different target environments. You have to like have a switch you can deploy a build to test it. Like it's wild and it's super fragile, right? And over time, we've been making this thing better and better and better, and it works pretty dang well at this point. But it's still a deployment is the most fragile, most stressful, and also most dangerous part of the whole thing that we do, right? Because if we deploy a bad bug, that's a huge problem. And so this actually relieved pressure on that part of the system because we needed to deploy fewer of those kinds of changes to the game itself as a platform. And so that actually made it so that process that is like the most dangerous part of the process is now actually less stressed. So it has more slack in it. It allows us to have more room to try new stuff and to make that process better because there's actually fewer builds coming through it. And I think, which leads me to my final thought about all this, which is the whole small batch thing, right? There's a nuance here that's really easy to lose because small batch is all about change management. It's like how many changes are you making at once before making sure that your changes are okay, right? And the more changes you make before making sure that it's fine, the more likely that it's not fine and it's hard to fix, right? That's like the gist of what this is all about, right? For small batch stuff. But delivery, like the small batch delivery, can mean anything. It can mean how many times I save the state of my code via a commit and say, take a snapshot here, snapshot there, do this frequently, right? At these different points. Or it can mean deploying it out to users. So when people are talking about this kind of stuff, like rapid deployments, this kind of thing, they're thinking of things like Netflix, right? Where they have a centralized system of thousands of servers that they can deploy an update into and force everybody in the universe to get that update at the same time, right? And they have systems to make that seamless so that like as the update comes through, people get switched onto other machines and it's all seamless and fine, right? And that's like the paradigm held up as like the standard of what you should be doing. But you can't do that in video games. Even if video games weren't local, like a thing you installed, but they were like a browser game or something, right? Because you can't just update the state of it on the fly. They're too complicated for that, right? Because if you do, like all of a sudden, a building that wasn't there before is just suddenly there in your game, right? Or something like it doesn't work that way.
Well, and even think about the consequence, right? Like let's say somebody's watching a show on Netflix, right? A server update goes out and their Netflix account forgets the place that they were at on that episode, right? What does that person have to do to recover from that catastrophic error? They just hit play on the episode and just like fast forward. Yeah. Okay. You can recover from that in 10 seconds, right?
The state is very low complexity, right? The state of what you were doing.
But in a video game, somebody could put 10,000 hours into something, and they do sometimes. And you could accidentally nuke that whole thing, right? And there's just no way to recover it at that point, depending on what went wrong, right? And so like you've got to be really careful about those kinds of things, and especially when it comes to like multiplayer stuff, right? Because you need everybody on the same version at the same time so that they can play together. But then you've got other stakeholders, like if you're deploying to a console, they have different cert processes, right? In terms of
you don't get to decide when the release happens because it has to go through that process.
You may say like, all right, the patch is ready, and then Nintendo's like, yeah, well, we'll get back to you in 2 weeks about that, buddy.
Yeah.
Right? And so,
but even if we didn't have that, you're still deploying to users who are playing on their hardware, so they have to go download the updated thing, right? So if you're pushing out 10 builds a day, and then your users have to go like update 10 times a day, like even a small game that's like 100 megabytes, which is a very small game these days, right? You're talking a gigabyte of downloads for that day, right?
Yeah.
It's not ideal.
It's not ideal, and nobody wants that. You actually cannot do continuous deployment for games, but also for anything where the thing you're deploying lives on the person's device. Unless you're doing
download
with,
the whole thing. Yeah.
Right, with small incremental updates that can be kind of patched in. But even then, you can't just change the state of something super complicated on the fly without bad things happening. So it still doesn't work even there.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's pretty tricky, I think, to manage all that stuff. But having something like the Game Changer where we've separated out the game data from the game code, and we can deploy changes to the data instantly to all platforms. Granted, this is something we're only doing internally, so we won't be doing this live. We won't be like changing the in-game content for live players while they're playing the game.
Well, we might want to, actually, because that's so much more cost effective than going through the full deployment process.
Well, yeah, it is, but there's problems with it because a lot of times the deployments that we make that change the data sometimes do change the shape of the data, which then require
it has to have rules.
Interpret it.
Yeah, it has to have rules that make that possible. But that is what we did with original Crashlands, was exactly that, where the game had a version and we had a way of updating remotely the content in the quests and like what the little outposts that you visit stuff look like. And we designed it so that things would be basically backwards compatible enough so that it either would know, I can't download this update because there's a conflict in the version, right? Or it would gracefully, actually, because I think what we set it up is that it would try to do everything, and then if it failed, it would just fall back on the prior version or something like that. It's like we had a system for it to make it so that was doable, right? And what it allowed us to do, because at that time especially, we had none of the tech and the skills and the knowledge that we do now with respect to deploying stuff. And so the cost to us of making a deployment to players back in the OG Crashlands days was so high. It was just
it basically took like 4 hours.
It took forever.
And also we had a Mac machine. It's like make a build on there, make an Android build on my computer, and then make a Steam build, and I'm not able to do anything in the game while those builds are churning out, So
and then it would get rejected twice, and then it hit players, and players would be like, "Oh, there's 5 bugs here that are causing breaking issues." It was, and we start the cycle over again.
Do it again.
It was brutal, and a lot of what allowed us to survive that at all was the ability to deploy at least a subset of updates, the ones related to questing and stuff, just remotely.
External to that process. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, this kind of, just to wrap it and get back to the the core idea that underpins all this stuff is that, if even at that time when working on the original Crashlands, if somebody said tell me about your job, what do you do? What do you do at your job? I would never have mentioned that.
Yeah.
I'd be like, I'm a programmer and I'm a designer, and we do a lot of collaborative iteration, blah, blah, blah. Would I say and about 16 hours of my week, I just sit there watching a compile process happen. And then for another 6 hours a week, I get a flood of bug reports that I sift through and try to figure out whether to ignore them because of how expensive it is to deploy things. And then about 13% of the time, I actually do the thing that I said earlier.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's really easy to just look at those things as like it's not what your job is. It's not how you think about what your job is. And so they're just these kind of bullshit things that you just get through so that you can do your job, as opposed to thinking about those things as they are in the way. And so the way to actually get your job done for real and do the work that you want to do is to hit pause on doing, quote, the work, right? And focus all your energy on making all those problems just not exist anymore. Just
A
make
really
them not
good
be problems.
exercise for this is to look at your work week, and if you would however you would describe your job to a random person who asks you about it. I'm a programmer. I'm a chef. Ask yourself realistically what percentage of your work hours are doing the thing that you claim to be doing. What percent is not that, and then what's going on in that not that chunk that you could. Because the thing is, like, you get huge, ridiculous gains out of stuff like this, which is what we've experienced, I think, largely over the last couple of years from all this DevOps stuff we've been doing, where you move it from Seth doing build stuff on his own machine every day for an hour at the end of the day to never. And it's not just like an hour every day. It ends up being actually like a 20% extra time.
Well, but that's even where things are wilder than you initially anticipate.
Yes.
Because like if you're caught up in just a lot of extra stuff, like administrative things, meetings, doing manual build deployments, whatever it is, let's say like at the end of all of that, you realize that only 20% of your time is going into like what you would consider to be the production, right? Whereas 80% of your time is going into all this other stuff, right? If you can get it switched over to like a 60-40 instead of an 80-20, right?
Yeah.
Then you have doubled the amount of productive work that you're able to do, right? Even though still less than half of your time is going into it, you've still doubled how much of it you're able to do, which is nuts.
And you've changed the quality of that time because it's now less impacted by the stuff that was around. And there's a nuance here to be really careful about, which is that, if I describe myself as a web programmer, which is I do for short, just to like to say something that somebody would grok and be like, okay, I roughly get it, right?
Yeah.
That's not my actual job, right? My actual job is to ensure the long-term viability of our studio with whatever means I need to, right? That's my actual job. There's not a title for that exactly, right? And that includes the web development stuff that I do but that's because of the context in which it's all happening, right? But it also includes all the administrative stuff too. And so the part of the nuance here is trying to figure out not just like what is my job if I call myself X, and then the rest is actually not my job and I should stop doing it, right? It's actually embracing the fact that you cannot do X without all this other stuff, but also that X, your job title, is not really your job. That's nobody's job is their job title. Yeah. Because if we're just there to program, then I guess program whatever the fuck you want. Who cares, right?
Yep.
If you're a writer,
that's a lines of code per day.
Yeah, exactly. Just slap words on something. Like, who cares, right? Like, no, it's not. That's not actually what you're doing.
Yeah, it's all about the why. It's why are you here? Yeah, and if you're here to ensure the long-term viability of the studio and make sure that we are super efficient and effective at what we're doing, right? That could look like anything. But there are all going to be things that get in the way of you being able to do that. Yeah. And in your particular case, it's kind of weird because, that's kind of self-referential because now you're part of the studio and your own viability and effectiveness is being messed up by this thing that's in your way. Yeah. So you in particular are very tuned into these kinds of things.
Yeah. Because the question is like, what could I be doing if I wasn't doing this that actually gets to the goals, like the bigger goals, right? And so once you identify that, then that's how you can start to pair out and say like, okay, somebody else could do this other stuff, or this doesn't have to be done. Or if I'm the only one that is like, has the responsibility to do this, even though it's not actually serving my core purpose, right? So let me find ways to make it easier if I can't just not do it or offload it, right? Like that's where that nuance comes in for how to draw that line, how to identify that stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot to it, but yeah, you gotta. I think maybe a term for this that so we're talking about how this was like boiling a frog, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how like several of us on the team are just kind of dealing with these problems, and we don't realize how hot the water is, right? So the solution is like you need to throw a new frog in.
Yeah,
right.
It's true.
Like you need a new frog to get in there who isn't acclimatized, and see how they feel about it. Right. Somebody it's get somebody unfamiliar with the process to come in and look at it and get a sense of what's going on.
And if you can't do that, you could also try to take one of the frogs out of the pot and let it cool down a bit, or put it in some cooler water and then put it back in, and then it'll be like, holy shit!
Yeah.
This is
Ow,
a lot worse than I remember it being.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Jen Coster, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.